Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation, kind introduction. I'm really honored to be the guest, and even the last guest this year at the CAT Center. And I'm happy to discuss with you some most recent really findings from my research on Jewish libraries and book collections in post-war Europe and in Israel. I have a presentation with some interesting, I hope, visual materials and also archival sources that I use in my research. So let me only share it with you. Where is it? Wait. Oh, we are already at the conclusion. Sorry. Yeah. Let me move to the beginning. Sorry for all the stars. Yeah. Okay, we are here, and you're welcome to take a look.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We're actually looking at the wrong screen, I think. We're looking at your talk rather than the...
You are looking at my talk. Wait a sec. Stop. I will try to... No, it's here. It should be here.
Yep.
What about now?
Yep, much better.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Wait a second. Now I cannot see the presentation. Oh, okay. It's all good. Can you see this now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
so
very good. Thank you so much.
Now, great. And I will just jump right in and start with the following scene. On October 22nd, 1956, Shlomo Shunami, a renowned Jewish bibliographer who was traveling through Europe in search of the Nazi-looted Jewish books for the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, hurriedly boarded a train from Budapest to Vienna. 3 days later, while following the New York insurgency against the Hungarian Stalinist government, from his hotel room in the Russian capital, Shunami wrote to Israel on his recent book search in Hungary as follows, and I quote, "I was lucky to escape Budapest a day, maybe just hours before the uprising. At the moment, we have no connection with the city, and even our legation here is unable to get in touch with our representatives there. All my missions so far have not required an eighth of the mental strength and nerves that I had to invest in Budapest. One can write a novel about the working and living conditions in the city. Wherever you are, you have the impression that you are being followed. In any case, you must assume that you are being followed. You need to check every scrap of paper in your possession, as the unexpected can happen at any time. I'm still under the influence of this nightmare, and sometimes I behave as if I were still there." End of quotation. And this was not the first, if perhaps the most dramatic time when Shunami witnessed a political upheaval in the Soviet Bloc during his mission to retrieve the cultural assets of the destroyed Jewish communities to Palestine and later the State of Israel. Towards the end of Second World War, as many of you know, hundreds of thousands of orphaned Jewish books were found all over Europe. Ironically, while the vast majority of the owners and former institutional homes perished in the Holocaust, these valuable remnants survived, for the most part, as a result of the Nazi cultural plan. And their presence shortly attracted attention of numerous Jewish organizations, which exerted enormous efforts to rescue them for the reconstruction of Jewish life in the post-war period. Hebrew University of Jerusalem was one of the first Jewish bodies that took a strong interest in the fate of Jewish books in Eastern Europe and sent its representatives, Shunami among them, to negotiate the transfer to Israel, which was, from the standpoint of the university authorities, a preferable destination for the remnants of the shattered Jewish heritage. In today's talk, I will zoom in on the Hebrew University restitution missions to the 3 major destinations within the post-war communist sphere of influence, let's call it like this, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and finally also Hungary, during the second half of the 40s and then throughout the 50s mainly. Drawing on the correspondences, reports, and testimonies that were written by the university amidst the Iron Curtain, I would like to add some light, hopefully, on the transfers of Jewish libraries from the Soviet Bloc to Israel and to illuminate the socio-political conditions that influenced this transfer in the post-war period. And in particular, I will explore here the encounter between the university emissaries on the one hand and the local Jewish communities in Prague, in Warsaw and Budapest, to emphasize an important, to my mind, yet hitherto overlooked role played by the Jewish survivors in Europe in relocating the Jewish cultural treasures to Jerusalem. But to situate these Eastern European missions of the university in an appropriate historical context, I will first briefly discuss how the university engaged at all with the Nazi-looted Jewish libraries after the war. So I will try to give you some background first and foremost. So since its establishment in 1925, the Hebrew University had cultivated very close ties with European Jewry and relied heavily on their support, which found its, I would say, tangible expression financial contributions, but also in numerous book donations to the university library. You can see the library building on Mount Scopus on the screen, whose holdings stemmed in the greater part of Europe as from Germany. Following the Nazi rise to power, many of the university professors were thus deeply anxious about the fate of Jewish books in Europe, a concern that later turned into an open call for their rescue in the wake of the November pogrom of 1938. And such voices grew stronger during the war and in its immediate aftermath once the annihilation of European Jews was revealed. The unprecedented destruction brought by the Nazi Jewish life in Europe prompted then numerous controversies over the question who should be entitled to the Jewish books and, of course, other cultural assets that were left behind by the perished. And the Hebrew University, to put it very shortly and in general terms, advocated that these treasures should find a new home in Palestine, where the Jewish traditions of learning could find their continuation after the Holocaust. This idea found its practical expression in the creation of the so-called Committee for Salvaging of Diaspora Treasures. In Hebrew, we call it Vada Lehatzalat Otzrot Hagola, in March 1944. So the primary goal of this body was to represent the university in future negotiations over restitution of the plundered Jewish culture objects and to secure their transfer to Jerusalem. When planning for the action in Europe, the committee members initially resolved to exclude from it all the countries that found themselves under Soviet control after the war. And as it was explained later at one of the meetings, despite being well aware that there were numerous extremely valuable cultural assets left by the perished Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, the committee members, they were quite skeptical about the chances of successfully negotiating with the Soviet authorities. And I quote, we have to approach this issue realistically and refrain from claiming libraries that are in the hands of Russians, as we will not gain them, read the protocol of this meeting. And I'm quoting again, instead, we need to turn to England and the USA. End of quote. And indeed, the university soon began cooperating with the New York-based Commission on European Jewish Culture Reconstruction, later known as the so-called JCR, Jewish Culture Reconstruction, which was established as well in mid-1944 and headed by Salo Baron. to deal with the restitution of earliest Jewish cultural property in the American zone of occupation in Germany. So the Hebrew University was fast to join the commission, even though it approached this cooperation with a certain ambivalence. On the one hand, joining this established American body was expected to bring better results in the negotiations with the American military government in Germany than an independent restitution claim. But on the other, the members of the Diaspora Treasures Committee perceived the commission as a competitor to the rediscovered Jewish treasures and were concerned about the future allocation under its auspices. And it was against that background that the idea to search for Jewish libraries in the Soviet Bloc was raised once again. This time, the committee decided in favor of organizing an independent salvage operation in the Eastern European countries, where the authority of the American Commission was not recognized, and the Hebrew University could just act alone. And its first destination was post-war Czechoslovakia. So due to its unique role in the Czechoslovakia was really one of the most important destinations visited by the university emissaries in the immediate post-war period. During World War II, Bohemian land served as one of the major collecting centers for the Nazi regime, which placed a large part of the plundered Jewish libraries, and we are really talking here about hundreds of thousands of books, in several castles in Sudetenland and in the Theresienstadt ghetto camp. You can see on the presentation one of the warehouses in Prague where those books were processed and registered and catalogued. And after the German capitulation, a lion's share of these treasures was transferred to the re-established Jewish Museum in Prague. The Hebrew University learned about the exceptional accumulation of Jewish libraries in Czechoslovakia in late 1945, and it was decided to act immediately for transfer to Jerusalem. In early 1940, a renowned professor of Jewish mysticism at the university was sent to Prague to negotiate an agreement on the donation of the rediscovered book to Palestine. You can see him again in Prague at my presentation. And he was followed by 4 other emissaries: Hugo Bergman, his older brother Arthur Bergman, then Zev Shek and Abraham Fischer, all natives of Czech lands, who continued the negotiations in Prague until 1949. During the mission, the emissaries engaged closely with the Jewish community in Prague, whose assistance, and this was understood clearly, in Jerusalem was necessary for the book transfer to succeed. However, the encounter with the Jewish survivors in Czechoslovakia proved a difficult one. And Scholem, who was the first to see the devastating results of the Holocaust on the local Jewish life, was perhaps the most skeptical of the very possibility of reconstruction of Czechoslovak Jewry. And I'm quoting, "Nothing will remain here but the cemetery and the synagogue, which has now become a museum." He summarized his impressions of the post-war Jewish Prague. So in the negotiations with the leaders of the Jewish community, he was very clear that in his perspective, leaving the valuable Jewish books in Czechoslovakia would just doom them to the spiritual and intellectual exile. And thus Scholem pleaded with them to transfer the books to Palestine as soon as possible and with the minimum involvement of the authorities. However, the Czechoslovak community held the books only in custody, and it was the Czechoslovak government that kept the legal title to the plundered libraries, and I will expand on this legal situation of the books in a moment. But thus, while willing to help the university, the community leaders refused at this point to send the books without official permission. They were afraid that such action might have severely endangered their efforts to establish a positive relationship with the Czechoslovak authorities, on the help of which they relied for the successful rehabilitation of Jewish survivors under their care. And this standstill in the negotiations was only overcome by Hugo Bergman, who came to Czechoslovakia later that year. Bergman arrived in this on November 6, 1946, and approached the Jewish survivors in an entirely different manner. He reflected on his encounter with the community leaders as follows, and I am quoting, "It was very difficult to see these men, who have lost their wives and children, being all relatively young people. But from a Jewish and Zionist perspective, the evening gave me a lot of hope. These few still have the old spirit and the will to start anew. They want an intimate connection with Palestine. They want articles that may be printed in the non-Jewish press. They want correspondence for their newspapers." Bergman did not remain indifferent to their needs and engaged not only with the transfer of books, but also with the organization for the Jewish survivors. And this approach not only improved the relations between the Hebrew University and the Jewish community in Prague, but it also proved much more effective in terms of mobilizing its members on the question of the books. Bergman did not insist that the transfer be organized without the relevant approvals of the state authorities, but he rather relied on the local Jewish leaders to acquire the necessary recommendations from the government. And this proved a complicated task, for, as I mentioned before, the books in question had been placed under the government, under the so-called National Property Administration, in accordance with a series of decrees issued in 1945 and 46 by Edvard Beneš, the first post-war Czechoslovak president. And this new legislation was strongly connected to the retribution against the Czechoslovakia German minority. As such, not only it nullified all the property transfers made as a result of pressure under the occupying forces, but it also granted the state the right first to safeguard and later to confiscate all the assets of the occupier, collaborators, as well as Germans and Hungarians who were collectively blamed for supporting the Nazi regime. And although these harsh measures, they seemingly did not apply to Jews and Jewish property, but they had severe consequences for the Jewish survivors, as the authorities failed to specify conditions for the restitution of the Nazi-looted Jewish property. And as a result, it was treated just as German property and lumped together with the assets of the so-called state enemies. In order to claim the Nazi-looted books for the Hebrew University, the representatives of the Jewish community in Prague had to petition numerous state bodies, among them the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Welfare, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the National and University Library in Prague, and so on, which, by the way, were not at all keen on giving up the authority over the cultural assets that could otherwise be sold for the benefit of the state. And only after a year of intense negotiations did the community receive permission for the transfer of some of the books, mainly duplicates and less valuable volumes, to Jerusalem. But the assistance provided to the emissaries by the Jewish survivors in Prague was crucial, not only in navigating this labyrinth of various regulations and demands placed by the Czechoslovak authorities, but also in managing the transfer of books to Palestine, which took place during the communist coup d'etat in the state, in the wake of which the negotiations on the transfer came to a sudden halt. In these new circumstances, the next university emissaries, oh, sorry, it's not here. Oh, okay, Arthur Bergman and Zev Shek. I don't know if you can see. Oh, you can see the check on the presentation. So they relied first and foremost on the connections made by Hugo with the employees of the Prague Jewish Museum, who handled the organization of the book transfer on behalf of the community. And with their help, which involved not only a lot of persuasion, but often also bribery, they eventually managed to acquire an export permit to transfer some 40,000 books to Palestine. When preparing this shipment, they took even a greater risk and replaced the crates containing duplicates with the manuscripts and other valuable volumes, for the transfer of which the university did not receive permission, in the hope that the Czechoslovak authorities would just not be able to effectively control such a large consignment. And this indeed went unnoticed, and the books were then dispatched in two shipments, the first in April and the second in September 1948. However, due to the escalating conflict in the state of Israel at that time, the libraries had to wait for more than a year in the harbor in Antwerp, Belgium, to complete their journey. They arrived in Israel only in January 1950, a few months before the Jewish Museum in Prague was officially nationalized by the Czechoslovak government. In the following years, some additional books and manuscripts were sent to Jerusalem by diplomats who worked at the Israeli legation in Prague. However, due to the semi-legal, let's say, in this way, nature of this transfer, the university resolved to keep them secret. And until today, the particulars remain mostly unknown. So let's maybe move to the second destination, to Poland now. The idea of bringing the libraries of the destroyed Jewish communities in Poland to the Hebrew University was first brought up by the university's financial advisor and a member of its executive committee named Aaron Mendel-Schneerson. In this capacity, Schneerson was delegated to Warsaw in 1947 to negotiate with the Polish authorities the possibility of transferring the earless and abandoned Jewish property to Palestine. As he recalled later, when planning for this trip, Schneerson began to ponder over the fate of Polish Jewish libraries. And I'm quoting, you can see this quotation on the screen. At that time, I took some interest in the fate of the Jewish libraries in Poland, most of which I knew well from the time I had spent in the country before the war. I wanted to get some information on their whereabouts, condition, and fate. I contacted those of my friends who were still in Poland, and after I heard from them, I set a kind of secondary plan for myself that when I come to Poland in connection with the general action, I will also try to obtain a permit to transfer the Jewish libraries there to the National Library in Jerusalem, end of quote. Schneerson arrived in Warsaw in mid-1997, and indeed, he immediately began his search for the abandoned Jewish books. His first steps led to the Jewish Historical Institute, which was a major Jewish cultural and scientific institutions in post-war Poland. You can see it again on the screen, and which had been founded only a few months before his arrival to inspect the Jewish book collections that had been brought there from all over the country, mainly by the members of the Central Jewish Historical Commission in Poland, often by the members of Joint as well. Despite the unparalleled destruction brought on Jewish libraries in Poland by the Nazi regime, many of the Jewish books did survive until the end of the war. You can see one of the warehouses in Upper Silesia, in Racibórz as well. And as previously in Czechoslovakia, the recovered libraries were formally placed under the custody of a Jewish body, in this case of the Central Committee of Polish Jews, which served as a representative organization of Polish Jewry since 1944, but as aptly summarized by Schneerson, and I am quoting, in practice, the only owner was the government. Again, between 1945 and 46, the Polish authorities passed 3 succeeding decrees, which stipulated, among others, that all the movable assets that the German were possessed by the former owners came under the formal category of abandoned property and were to be managed by the so-called liquidation offices, urzędy liquidacyjne in Polish, on behalf of the state. As in Czechoslovakia, there were no special provisions for the management and restitution of Jewish property, which was effectively treated as abandoned property. And thus, Schneerson focused primarily on the negotiations with the Polish authorities. He reported on his strategy as follows. I knew from the beginning that my offer has to be based on the known give and take principle, because otherwise there is no chance for a positive result. The financial and economic situation of the state, particularly the hunger for a foreign currency, but also the general atmosphere and the dominant attitude of the governing party in every aspect of life in Poland today, all these factors led to the negative attitude of the authorities towards offers of this kind. And eventually, Schneerson proposed that in return for the transfer Jewish property left in Poland, including our libraries, the Hebrew University would establish a cathedra for the Polish Jews that would serve as an academic hub for research on Polish Jewish history in Palestine, as well as a memorial for the perished Polish Jewry. He then presented this proposal to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which declared its support for the endeavor. And equipped with the permission of the authorities, Schneerson approached now the Central Committee of Polish Jews and the community in Warsaw to win their support for the re-establishment of the Polish branch of the Society of Friends of the Hebrew University, because he believed that the reconstruction of this body, which was one of the most important advocates of the university in pre-war Poland, would symbolize the renewal of cultural ties between the Yishuv and post-war Polish Jewry. But simultaneously, he also hoped that the transfer of Jewish books to Jerusalem could be the first task on its agenda. And indeed, this branch was shortly reinstated and counted among its members some very prominent personalities from both Polish and Polish Jewish intellectual elites. And alongside the talks with the Jewish community and the Polish authorities, Schneerson engaged in preparations for the transfer of books collected at the Jewish Historical Institute. Working under time pressure, he was prevented really from conducting a thorough examination of the libraries, but he reported that he did try to include in the shipment the most valuable treasures, and in particular the collections that belong to the Chachamei Lublin Yeshiva, one of the most important institutions of Jewish learning in Eastern Europe before the war. Ultimately, he succeeded in bringing about 85,000 books to the harbor in Gdynia, and the first shipment, some 66,000 volumes, left Poland already at the beginning of 1948. But again, in the wake of the war in Palestine, the collections had to be temporarily stored in Cyprus, and they found their way to Jerusalem only in August 1949. By the end of that year, about 20,000 more books had arrived at the university. And you can see here at the screen a book plate that was stick to all the books brought by Schneerson from Poland at this time. And then, despite the growing unrest in Jerusalem and the increasingly deteriorating relations between the Polish authorities and the newly established State of Israel, which began gradually reorientate towards the Western powers, in Warsaw managed to continue its work for the University of the branch for delivery until its closure in the early spring of 1950. And they were instrumental in initiating publication exchange between numerous Polish scientific and cultural institutions and the Hebrew University also throughout the 50s. Among the gifts sent to Jerusalem with their help was, for instance, a private library of Heinrich Himmler, with some really rare examples of anti-Semitic literature that was found in Poland after the war. And overall, until the last months of its activity, the Society sent to Jerusalem more than 15,000 volumes, a great part of which were again donated by the Jewish Historical Institute. On the screen, I have one of the cables confirming the shipment of these volumes to Jerusalem. And now, finally, we can move to our last destination for today, namely the Hungary. The mission in Hungary was not only the last, but also the longest endeavor undertaken by the Hebrew University. Here, a vital role was played by the re-established Jewish community in Budapest and by the Jewish Rabbinical Seminary in the city, both of which had cooperated closely with the Hebrew University before the war. After the German capitulation, the Jewish survivors in Budapest invested some great efforts into bringing the remains of the Jewish libraries that had been plundered or damaged during the occupation into one central collection that was created on the premises of the Rabbinical Seminary. The collection included books from some of the most important Jewish Hungarian institutions, among others from the local Jewish gymnasium, the Jewish community, and the Rabbinical Seminary itself, as well as some remarkable private libraries, such as the Library of Immanuel Löw, a renowned Jewish Hungarian rabbi and scholar who served at the Jewish community in Szeged throughout his life. Following the end of the war, the Jewish survivors in Szeged decided to donate the Löw collection together with the extremely valuable community archives to the National and University Library in Jerusalem. But in the meantime, the library was transferred to the Rabbinical Seminary in Budapest, which was just much better equipped to take care of these precious volumes. And another important Jewish library in Budapest that was bequeathed to Israel was a private library of Rabbi Leo Zinger, who served in the Jewish community in Várpalota and was an active member of the Mizrahi movement in Hungary. Once the leaders of the Rabbinical Seminary, there were two heads at that time, David Shmuel Levinger and Alexander Scheiber, informed the Hebrew University about this accumulation of Jewish libraries in Hungary, it was decided to send Shlomo Dov Goitein, a well-known German Jewish Arabist, whose father had stemmed from a long line of Hungarian rabbis, to Budapest. The official aim of his visit was to permit the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the seminary, but in practice, he was requested to find out about the possibilities of gaining the recovered Jewish libraries in the country for Israel. Goitein arrived in Budapest in August 1948 for 6 weeks. You can see his report from this visit. And during his stay, he focused on meeting with the leaders of the Jewish organizations and communities, as well as on inspecting the books that had been collected at the Rabbinical Seminary. Beyond the latter, one of the most important institutional partners that was contacted by Goitein in Budapest at that time was perhaps the Hungarian branch of the Society of Friends of the Hebrew University, which had been re-established shortly before his arrival. When in Budapest, Goitein agreed to deliver an inauguration lecture for the branch, which indeed took place on September 14th, 1948. The members of the society set two main goals for its post-war activity. And first, to take care of the abandoned and unused Jewish books and to transfer them to Jerusalem. And second, to establish a kind of information center for those interested in studying at the Hebrew University. The university, on its part, was, of course, very much interested in attracting new students from Europe, and instructed going to help with the organization exams in the Hebrew language for the potential candidates. Although he did not manage to complete the transfer of books to Jerusalem, Goitein definitely laid the grounds for the cooperation between the Hebrew University and the Jewish survivors in Budapest during the next decade, and made the intellectuals in Jerusalem more aware of the precarious situation of Hungarian Jews under the Soviet regime. He summarized the outcome of his visit as follows, and I am quoting: "My friends in Jerusalem surely thought that I would return to Israel with boxes of the Louvre Library bundled on my shoulders. But this great thing cannot be finished so quickly, especially in light of the tension and panic that our Hungarian brothers experienced during those weeks that I visited them. While it is not possible to take the books out of Hungary at the moment, in any case, the Jewish Hungarian community is important and should be taken care of. If possible, suitable colleagues who know Hungarian should go there and give them appropriate spiritual food." The management of the Hebrew University followed Goitein's suggestions and sought to keep friendly relations with Jewish and Zionist bodies in Budapest. Accordingly, Goitein was replaced by Shlomo Shunami, a native of Mukachevo in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who directed the Diaspora Treasures Department at the university's library. Shunami kept close ties, especially with the local Jewish community in Budapest, whose library was reconstructed with the help of book donations from Jerusalem. However, the organization of the larger book transfer proved again a Herculean task, as the Hungarian authorities were reluctant to release the Jewish libraries, not even those bequeathed to the university. Shunami summarized it as follows, and I quote: "Never denied that they were the Hebrew University property, but for years, using all kinds of pretexts they stalled." These difficulties aptly reflected, I think, the general reluctant attitude of the Hungarian authorities towards the restitution of Jewish property. Although since the end of the war, the subsequent governments passed a series of acts and decrees in Poland and Czechoslovakia, they committed to the restoration of plundered property to the owners, or with respect to earless assets to the organizations representing the survivors. In practice, little was done to implement this legislation. In the case of the libraries requested by the university, the Hungarian authorities demanded first that they be presented with a detailed registration list of all the books included in the shipment to Jerusalem. The registration was conducted by the students of the rabbinical seminary and completed by the spring of 1949. However, despite meeting the demands, the seminary's leaders were continuously denied the necessary export permits, as the Hungarian government adopted an increasingly anti-Zionist agenda. Meanwhile, the consolidation of power in the hands of the Communist Party and the rapidly closing emigration window prompted Löwinger, who served as the head of the rabbinical seminary since 1942, to flee to Israel. He arrived in Jerusalem in May 1950 at the invitation of the Hebrew University to participate in the celebration of its 25th anniversary. Expected to return to Budapest in mid-June that year, Löwinger decided to stay and then settle in Israel, even though he left all his property, all his belongings in Hungary. And in Budapest, he was replaced by Scheiber, who now single-handedly headed the rabbinical seminary. As such, Scheiber became one of the most important contacts of the Hebrew University in Hungary in the following years. Despite the anti-Zionist repressions and trials that took place from 1949 until approximately 1954, Scheiber managed to send some of the seminary's most valuable manuscripts to Löwinger, who then deposited them at the university's library. And you can see one of the letters, actually a Hebrew translation of his letter, in which he confirms sending those manuscripts to Jerusalem. In this period, his parcels and sporadic messages were the only form of contact between the university and the seminary, as Shunami struggled to receive an entry visa from the Hungarian authorities. He succeeded in achieving the entry permit only in 1956, when he was on another research mission in Austria. At the beginning of October of that year, and stayed in the city for 3 fateful weeks before the outbreak of the revolution. During this visit, not only Shunami engaged again with the local Jewish bodies, but he also approached several important Hungarian institutions. Among others, he initiated a publication exchange with the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and the National Library of Hungary. The support of these two major scientific bodies proved essential in receiving the permit for the transfer of the Louvre Library to Israel, which Shunami acquired towards the end of his visit. And here you can see some of the documents from the Louvre estates that are now available at the National Library in Israel, and that they were received from this very shipment. This success prompted him in turn to begin negotiations on the acquisition of the famous David Kaufman collection that was housed at the Academy of Sciences. As Shunami testified later, he was presented with the price of some $140,000, which was just much below the market value of this precious collection. But at that time, the university could offer only $80,000, and the transaction stalled. Neither was he successful in finalizing the transfer of other Jewish libraries from Budapest. Between 56 and 62, Shunami sought to convince Scheiber to immigrate to Israel and bring the book collections of the rabbinical seminary with him, but the latter was too afraid to leave Hungary without securing employment in Israel. Shunami also tried to acquire an export permit for the books of the Orthodox Jewish community in the city, which had gifted them to the university, but again to no avail. Only a few single manuscripts were transferred in this period, with the help of the Israeli legation in Budapest. We can see the same pattern as in Czechoslovakia and Poland previously. Beyond them, it seems that the Louvre Library was the only complete Jewish Hungarian collection that eventually arrived in Jerusalem in the beginning of 1958. Furthermore, it also seems to be the last collection that crossed the Cold War borders on the way to Israel. When Shunami visited Budapest again in 1960, he came back with the growing realization that with the consolidation of communist power in this region, the window of opportunity for transferring the Jewish heritage out of Eastern Europe had closed. And I quote, this is the last quotation: "The political situation of Jews has not improved here and may have even worsened. From what I have seen, the fear of being suspected of Zionism increased and caused a terrible decline in Jewish life. The regime of terror infected a large part of Jewish leaders, and the faith decreased dramatically." To conclude, in the wake of the Hebrew University restitution missions in Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, thousands of books from the pre-war Jewish communities left Eastern Europe and were transferred to Jerusalem, where a new chapter in the history began, one that was no longer connected to the history of Eastern European Jewry, but rather to that of the State of Israel. And over the following decades, under the shadow of numerous political turbulences that marked the development of Israel in the Middle East, the memory of their singular journey across the Cold War borders to Jerusalem faded slowly into oblivion. And against this background, by exploring the activity of the university in Eastern Europe, I have sought to emphasize here, first and foremost, the valuable contribution made by the Jewish communities in the Soviet Bloc to the cultural development, to the cultural heritage of Israel. Notably, while facing enormous difficulties in regaining their own property, the Jewish survivors invested strenuous efforts in helping to transfer the valuable collections to Jerusalem. Many of the treasures brought from Prague, Warsaw, and Budapest may still be found at the National Library of Israel today. And to sum it all up, I would like to argue, and I would like to leave you maybe with this thought, that the examined episode may teach us a lot on the complex relationship between the crystallization of the Cold War political constellation and the restitution of Jewish cultural property. And specifically, it demonstrates, to my mind, that despite the changing socio-political climate in Eastern Europe and the growing anti-Jewish as well as anti-Zionist sentiments, the Hebrew University found a unique window of opportunity to gain Jewish cultural property for Palestine and then the State of Israel. Acquiring these valuable cultural assets was possible not only due to the unique position of the Yishuv between Western and Eastern powers before the establishment of the state, but also, if not above all, thanks to the efforts invested by the university emissaries into rebuilding these close relationships with the Jewish communities in the Soviet Bloc. In the end, it was their continuous help that proved essential to reaching the libraries despite the widespread nationalization and despite the growing distrust of the communist governments towards Israel. And I think that this assistance should not be taken for granted and definitely should be appreciated also today. Yeah, this would be all from my side. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that. It's so rich. There's so much to discuss. We have just a few minutes for questions. And there have been a couple submitted already. I want to begin with one that was asked about whether or not things went missing in all of this. In particular, the questioner is suggesting that the library director of the Jewish Theological Seminary in Budapest has argued that the post-war communist regime in Hungary in particular created losses to the Jewish book holdings. In other words, that things went missing without a trace. And it seems like this is a context with just warehouses and boxes of books, where it would be very easy for items to be set aside, for valuable items to be pulled out of collections. Do we have evidence that that happened? And do we know anything about the fates of any books that went missing in this period?
Of course, I mean, the missing books, the history of missing books is just the other part of the story. Sometimes when we talk about the restitution, so we focus so much on what did survive past 45, but of course, not only in Hungary, but in all the other countries, Poland, Germany as well, there were hundreds of thousands of books lost, perished, and dispersed. It's very difficult to trace this history of dispersion and the destruction, because we have no archival materials for that. The only source for Hungary that I'm aware of would be the Jewish Museum in Budapest. And unfortunately, they are not very advanced with the catalogization of the archival holdings. Up to this point, I did not manage to find anything on the missing collections, very few materials on the books that did survive. So this would be the challenge, how to document the destruction. We know that what was left was only partial, but this is again not special to, not unique to Hungary or even to the Eastern Bloc. It is also a story of the West, just the destruction brought by the Nazi regime. So yeah, another way of looking into this would be to to search the collections of the National Library of Israel. To that point, I again managed to localize only a few sources documenting what survived and not the manuscripts. Okay, so yeah, it would be very to research what was lost.
I think of course, yeah, so much was lost. I think the question in its intent was more about if there are items that were known at some point to be in the possession of the post-war states, and were supposed to go to Israel, but disappeared along the way. In other words, not only books that were lost from the Jewish community writ large, but it sounds as though
of course. I mean, again, to my understanding, and this is really a very new research that I'm conducting now, to my understanding, only a fracture, even of those Jewish books that had been collected at the rabbinical seminary, for instance, after the war, and then they were a kind of they were expected to arrive in Israel, so only a fracture. Actually, the Lev collection is the only one that we know for sure. This very single manuscripts sent unofficially by Schreiber would be another trace, but the vast majority of those collections stayed in Budapest, and they fade in the afterwards is pretty much unknown.
Wow. Okay. Wow. So I think the that answer provides a kind of a strong argument for the value of sending these collections to Israel at that moment, right? Of course, it wouldn't have been obvious to everyone at the time that Israel was the appropriate owner of those books as a representative of the Jewish people or as a state institution. And so in the few minutes that remain, I wonder if you could open up for us a little bit who objected to such a move and why. So did some of the local Jewish communities object on the basis that we, the Jews of Poland, for example, should retain the books? Clearly, some of the states themselves were resistant to giving up the books, but was that on principle, or was it only a sense that the books were valuable? Can you talk a little bit about the debate?
Sure. Wow, this is really a great question, and also something that I found so fascinating. We're moving from researching the Jewish cultural restitution in Western Europe to the Soviet Bloc, that let's say we have here, to my understanding, two fronts. We have the official state front, the governments, the authorities, and then we have the Jewish communities. So I will start from the Jewish communities first. And one of the things that was so striking to me when I moved to the Eastern Europe was that the Jewish communities actually encouraged this transfer. And this is a totally different story than we have in Germany, for instance, and then in Austria, in Italy, when there was a huge controversy between the re-established Jewish communities that, to put it in a very general terms, wanted to keep those treasures to themselves. And we have even, there is I think at least an article, probably even a PhD dissertation on this controversy between the re-established Jewish communities in Germany and IRSO, the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization, about the Jewish property. We again can see the same kind of tension in Italy between the local Jewish communities, which also wanted to keep those treasures in Italy exclusively, whereas in Eastern Europe, all those community kind of not only agreed, they participated actively in this transfer, as if understanding that that these assets would have much better life in Israel. Okay, to my understanding, it can be connected to the somehow to this growing realization that with ethnic homogenization of Eastern Europe, of Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, being Jewish and the Jewish culture won't be celebrated. So actually I do not see the reason as usual in the nationalization and in the communist power, but in this growing realization that against this increasingly homogenic setting, the Jewish culture, it won't be a place, Eastern Europe, anymore in a few years. And this is one of the most striking differences to me between the Western and Eastern part of the Iron Curtain. So this would be my answer regarding the who did not oppose. So who opposed, and we can see this again in all the three instances where the authorities, that wanted to keep the legal titles to themselves, that created the laws. And again, it's very striking that in those three instances, we have seemingly regulations that should have enabled Jewish communities to regain this property, but it didn't really work. There weren't really provisions for the restitution of Jewish assets. So we can really see the local authorities and then the national authorities trying to prevent this and trying to sell these assets for the benefit of the state, or to use it in a kind of bargain with the Jewish communities regarding the restitution or of maybe more valuable assets. So this opposition would come from the part of the governments, whereas the Jewish communities really tried to help and really tried to bring those assets to Israel, which was really not so obvious at that time, I think.
Thank you. That's really clear and really, really fascinating. So since we're out of time, I think we'll stop there. I want to thank you again. This was amazing to listen to, and a couple of people asked to make sure that this will be online. Yes, it will. We will process the video and put it on the Cat Center's YouTube channel so you can review and share it. And I want to thank everybody out there for coming, and look forward to seeing you at our Zoom programming next fall. So keep an eye out for word from the Cat Center, and very, very much luck with your ongoing project, Anna.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure.